Hey everybody, I'm Carl Lanning, Brazos River Charter School with This Week in History, specifically the week of November the 8th through 14th. Well, first of all, this week we will deal with this lovely lady right here. On November the 9th, 1914, Hedy Lamar was born. She was an actress best known for her role in the film Samson and Delilah. Though she was a glamorous actress who, in some ways, sort of personified the Hollywood lifestyle. She was married 6 times. The longest one, I believe, lasted 7 years. The average seemed to be about a year and a half or so. Uh, what is lesser known is her inventive side. Very intelligent lady. Lamar was gifted with a very creative mind, and she put it to use during World War II in an attempt to help the war effort beyond just selling war bombs. She and a friend, a composer by the name of George Antheil, came up with the idea for what they called the frequency hopping broad spectrum. It was a radio guidance device for torpedoes that would be almost impossible to jam, as the guidance frequency would shift rapidly from one to another. Now, the technology at the time was not practical, but they did file a patent on it. And a decade later or so, the United States Navy picked up the idea and used it to help develop sonobuoys for finding submarines. It is also happens to be the foundational technology for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Now, Lamar and her friend also contributed to work that would save a lot of sailors' lives, particularly against the kamikazes in the Pacific. That was to the proximity fused anti-aircraft shell. A small transmitter would send out a signal to tell the shell when to explode when it was close enough to an enemy aircraft. That way it could destroy the aircraft without ever actually having to strike it. This made anti-aircraft fire much, much more lethal. So, beauty and brains, that's Hedy Lamar. And on November the 8th of 1986, Mr. Vyacheslav Molotov died. He had been the foreign minister of the Soviet Union for a number of years, particularly under Stalin. He was also the inspiration for the very famous Molotov cocktail, or at least his name was. Now, in 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The Finnish forces were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, particularly in tanks and anti-tank weapons. When Finnish and international observers started reporting about the Soviets bombing unprotected Finnish civilian populations and killing citizens, Molotov went on the radio and various other media denying this. He said they were not bombing these cities, they were actually dropping containers of food to the hungry civilians. Well, this was the actual type of bomb that they were dropping. The Finns called these bombs Molotov's bread baskets. So they responded to the tank threat with Molotov cocktails, which they called a drink to wash down the bread. They say they would set up ambushes of Soviet tanks and armored columns and throw the cocktails onto the engine compartment, try to burn the rubber parts of the treads, or if they could get it through some sort of a slit in the armor, inside and burn up the crews. Finnish forces inflicted such heavy casualties that the Soviets had to give up their plan to conquer the entire country and settle for a fairly small sliver of it. Molotov himself reportedly despised that his name was attached to this little simple firebomb. Well, the Molotov cocktail. And you may remember last week mentioned this little invention. On November the 9th of 1965, Mr. and Ms. Blonsky of New York were granted a patent for, and here it is, quote, apparatus for facilitating the birth of a child by centrifugal force. The device was actually, there were sketches of it, and a scaled down working model consisted basically of a turntable that the mother, very pregnant mother and supposedly ready to deliver, would be strapped to. The turntable would then begin to rotate, and when sufficient speed was reached, the baby would slide out of the birth canal due to the G forces and would then be caught in a net between the mother's legs, which is referred to as the infant reception net. I really can't imagine why this didn't catch on. I just can't see why a mucho pregnant woman wouldn't want to be spun around like a record on a record player. And the infant reception net is brilliant. Anyway, moving on. Finally, on November the 8th of 1895, Mr. William Röntgen took the world's first X-ray. To this very day in Germany, you do not go get an X-ray, you go to be Röntgened. Now, the very first image captured was that of his wife Bertha's hand. He asked her to leave her wedding ring on so that he could get the contrast in the image. Upon seeing it herself for the very first time, Bertha was absolutely aghast. She explained, "I've seen my own death." She refused to ever have another X-ray image made. I imagine it would be rather shocking for the first time in human history to actually be able to see through the skin. Well, the world's first X-ray. Well, that's all for this week, but just to let you know what's coming up next week, we will meet the real-life inspiration for this fellow and see his rather unpleasant fate. Thank you for your time. I'm Carl Lanning, Brazos River Charter School, and we look forward to seeing you right here next week.